All right, class, in this lecture, we're going to continue learning about NEPA, but we're going to really talk about the specifics of what it requires and how it works. So by the end of this lecture, you want to make sure you understand specifically what's the difference between an EIS, an EA, and a categorical exclusion. So that's what we're aiming for, and for you to understand the basics of the process for those. Section 102 of the law is what's considered the action forcing part of NEPA. This is the part of the law that actually requires federal agencies to do something. And here's what it says. It says, to the fullest extent possible, the policies of the U.S. shall be interpreted and administered in accordance with this act. And so when you see that word shall, that tells you that now the law is telling you something that absolutely has to happen. And what this part of the law says is that an interdisciplinary team, so that meant that all the federal agencies had to make sure they now hired people from multiple disciplines to do this. And it really expanded the federal workforce to get these interdisciplinary teams within the federal agencies to implement these laws. For example, the Forest Service had to go hire social scientists and hydrologists and fisheries biologists and wildlife biologists in addition to their road engineers and their silviculturists to be able to comply with this law. So the law says an interdisciplinary team must prepare an environmental impact assessment for any major federal action that will significantly affect the quality of the environment. And in that environmental impact assessment, they have to consider the environmental impact of planned actions and any alternatives that they could look at for how to get at that planned action. And they also have to look at a no action alternative. So what would happen to the environment if they did nothing? And they basically have to list out all these alternatives and look at the environmental impacts of each of those alternatives in these environmental impact assessments. These are long documents, and every federal agency has to comply with NEPA when they plan anything. So you're planning a timber harvest, you have to comply with NEPA. If you're going to build infrastructure, you have to comply. If you're going to change policy, typically you have to comply with NEPA. And it can even affect private land like a ski area. If the federal agency is going to implement a permit or issue a permit for that area, before they make any decision, including issuing a permit, they have to go through this process of writing these environmental impact assessments that are going to look at the potential impact of all planned actions and look at potential alternative ways that they could do that planned action. There are a couple different types of documents that agencies write under NEPA, and one is considered an EA or an environmental assessment. Agencies will prepare an EA if they're not sure if they're going to have a significant impact on the environment. And so they do this as sort of like a mini NEPA to see if they need to do the bigger version, which is an EIS. They'll analyze environmental effects, they'll involve the public, and this is what's most commonly done under NEPA are these environmental assessments. Agencies prepare about 45,000 of these a year compared to about 450 EISs every year. We're going to talk about EISs in a minute, but those are the documents you prepare if you are going to have a significant impact on the environment. So let's talk about what would be in an environmental assessment. The basic process for an environmental assessment would be as an agency. Let's say I'm the Forest Service and I want to plan a timber harvest. I'm going to write up my proposed action and then I'm going to notify the public about it. So I'm going to say, hey, public, I'm thinking about harvesting timber on these 10,000 acres. I write up the proposed action, I issue it formally, and then I go out and do what's called scoping, which is where I have public meetings or I take letters, and I basically get the public's input on what environmental effects and alternatives I should consider. Then I'm going to go back to my office, and with my interdisciplinary team, I'm going to write a draft environmental assessment. And in that document, it's going to state the proposed action. I'm going to look at the alternatives and the environmental effects for each alternative. Then I'm going to take that draft back out to the public, take comment again, and then I'm going to issue eventually my final environmental assessment, and then ultimately we'll issue a decision about what we're going to do. So that's the general process that happens under NEPA. And the basic content of these documents is that you'll have really generally 4 chapters. One will describe the proposed action. The second one will describe the alternatives we're looking at for how to get at that proposed action. And remember, we're also going to consider a no action alternative. What would happen to the environment if we did nothing? Then we're going to describe what's the affected environment. So what do we need to consider? Is it soils? Are there threatened and endangered species out here? Is there a lot of recreation? What are the environmental resources we're looking at? And then we'll describe in chapter 4 the environmental effects to all of those resources for all of the alternatives. You guys can imagine that this is a huge process, and this is where there are a lot of jobs in the federal agencies. And if you're a good writer or project leader, or you like to help make good decisions, Leading NEPA processes can be a really good job to help guide federal agencies in making good decisions and also engaging with the public effectively. So I mentioned that environmental assessments are kind of like mini NEPAs. And once the environmental assessment is completed, two things can happen. The agency can issue a statement saying, we found no significant impact, and then they don't have to write an environmental impact statement, which is like the big version of NEPA. Or they could say, we are going to have a significant impact on the environment. We need to do an EIS. Environmental impact statements are really the biggest version of NEPA, and they're what are the documents that are done for major federal actions that will significantly affect the environment. The process is very similar. You take your proposed action out, you do your scoping, you write a draft environmental impact statement with your alternatives and all your chapters in there. You take public comment, you use that comment to improve your document, and then you write a final environmental impact statement. In that, you're going to also respond to all the comments you got. You're going to improve your alternatives, you'll improve your analysis, and then eventually you'll issue your record of decision. Now, it's important to know that EISs, each one costs on average at least $1 million to write. They're really only done for major federal actions, things like building a dam or siting a nuclear power plant, or like if you're going to plan timber harvest over 1 million acres, you would do an environmental impact statement. They are big investments of time and energy, and they're done for these really significant types of projects. Again, environmental impact statements are done for major federal actions that may significantly affect the environment, but there's nothing in NEPA that says the agency has to choose the most environmentally beneficial option. They just have to consider all the impacts and basically discuss them with the public. So this is a little bit frustrating for people when they sort of first meet NEPA, because they feel like, okay, what's the point of all this analysis? You're going to have all this content in these documents. The introduction, the purpose and need of your proposed action, your alternatives in Chapter 2, all the aspects of your environment that are going to be affected in Chapter 3, and then all of the environmental consequences in Chapter 4. But what's the point if the agency doesn't have to actually choose the most environmentally sound alternative? And I want you to just think about that for a minute. Really, what's the point of this? Can you imagine why this would actually change or improve decisions to be more pro-environment? Why did Congress pass a law that requires all of this analysis, but not necessarily a certain kind of decision? Now, we'll come back to that topic of the pros and cons of NEPA, but there's one more category of compliance with NEPA. So you can do an environmental assessment. If you're not sure your project is going to have a significant impact, or if you're pretty sure it's not, then you do an EA. If you know your project's going to have a significant impact, you just skip straight to an EIS. Or there's also this category of actions called categorical exclusions. And these are groups of actions that we know are not going to have a significant impacts on the environment, and so they're just excluded from NEPA analysis. Agencies can set up categorical exclusion categories. They have to do it through rulemaking, or Congress can establish CADEX categories. They used to be for things like, updating your human resource procedures, or, maybe updating your bathroom facilities, things that really didn't need to go through NEPA analysis or necessarily weren't a good use of time. But CADEXs have become more controversial. Over time, there's been concern about things being categorically excluded from NEPA that might have many small impacts but lead to cumulative impacts over time. And CADEXs have become less specific over time and used more politically. Today, over 75% of Forest Service timber projects are done under a categorical exclusion with no NEPA analysis. That's 50% of the acres they treat. And there's a lot of controversy about categorical exclusions. Groups can sue that maybe certain things shouldn't be excluded from NEPA analysis, or that a whole category of actions is not valid. In 2007, the Forest Service tried to exclude any prescribed burning under 4,500 acres, and the courts threw it out. They said that just has to fall under NEPA analysis. You can't just exclude it from NEPA. So these have become pretty controversial, and you'll see them in NEPA decision trees. So I wanted you to be familiar with them. Now, an exercise to do on your own is to maybe try to map the decision process for NEPA. And you can take a quick look at the next slide, but then I would consider I would recommend that you try to do this on your own. And you want to start with this question of, is there a major federal action that may have a significant impact? And the answer might be yes, and then what would you do? If the answer is no, what might you do? If the answer is no and there's a CADEX category, what might you do? And try to include in your decision tree the major process steps, Consider maybe circling or starring the public participation opportunities. And under your EIS, at least list out the major process steps and the sections of content required. And this is kind of a good study exercise for you to do to make sure that you understand NEPA. But I've also included on the next slide one that comes from federal agencies. But I really recommend you just take a quick look at that and try to do this on your own, because it'll help you remember and kind of think through the process. This is a pretty good decision tree that actually comes from, I think, from a local agency. I can't remember exactly where I got this, but it's just a pretty good overview of how you might draw your decision tree. And you can look through this process. There are a lot of them online. There's one thing on here maybe I'll tell you about, which is that you might have a categorical exclusion category that you can use. For example, the Forest Service has one that says for any green timber sale under 80 acres, it's categorically excluded from NEPA. You don't have to do an EA or an EIS. But they do have to ask themselves if there are extraordinary circumstances present. Like, for example, is there an endangered species there? In those cases where there are extraordinary circumstances, they have to do an EA anyway. Now, you can just forget about everything I just told you because it's pretty advanced. But I just wanted to tell you in case you're looking at this and you're wondering what's this extraordinary circumstances thing over on the left. Take a moment now before you walk away from this lecture to think about some of the pros and cons of NEPA so far. And I want you to consider that NEPA doesn't require agencies to choose the most environmentally sound alternative. But think about, for example, if it did, what would that mean for building dams or for harvesting timber or for building an army base? We have other priorities in government. So maybe for Congress to write a law that required the agencies to always choose the most environmentally sound alternative, that would have meant we were raising the environment and environmental concerns over all other national objectives. We didn't do that. So I want you to think about, well, what are the pros and cons of this law? How might it work? Why would an agency just considering all of its environmental impacts, why would that maybe lead to better decisions in terms of the environment? Give that some thought, and we'll maybe try to talk about it during our in-class session. But this is a question I'll ask you on your exam next week as well. So you want to start listing these out and trying to critically analyze what the benefits of NEPA might be.